This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, let me thank John and Peter and Philip for the kind invitation. I'm very glad to be speaking here today. And I might just mention that I'm very interested in the relationship between the two strands that John talked about, because at the APA meeting I was at this year, there was a special session devoted to reception studies, which was very interesting and I think well received. So to begin, in his magisterial study of the medieval and humanistic glosses on Ovid's Ibis, Lapenna references a commentary transmitted in a manuscript now housed at the Vatican with the shelf mark Reg Lat 1801, containing a full commentary on the poem that he describes as, and I quote, independent of Calderini's commentary published in 1474. Lapenna, who knew of this commentary solely from the Vatican manuscript, makes very little use of it in his edition of Select Scholia to the Ibis. My own research on the humanistic tradition of Ovid commentaries, undertaken for a projected fascicle of the Catalogus Translationum et Commentariorum, has revealed that this commentary was authored by Bernardo Moretti, a Bolognese rhetorician working around 1460. In addition to his commentary on the Ibis, Moretti was also the author of two lives of Ovid and a versified biography of Ovid. His work seems to have been relatively influential in the late 15th century, since I have been able to identify a large number of hitherto unknown manuscript copies of the commentary, increasing the number from 1 to some 8 known witnesses. And I might mention on the handout, which I think is in your packet, I've listed those manuscripts at the bottom of the handout, and there's references to the bibliography that I may be mentioning in the talk on that handout as well. In this paper, I wish to survey Moretti as a commentator on Ovid, briefly discussing his biographies of the poet, and then focusing my attention on the commentary on the Ibis. Moretti was first identified as a commentator on the Ibis by Philip Laab in his Nova Manuscriptorum sive specimen antiquarum lectionum Latinarum et Graecarum, published in Paris in 1653. He notes Bernardo Moretti, who taught rhetoric at Bologna in 1459 and wrote a commentary on the Ibis of Ovid. Moretti was also alluded to very briefly by Fantuzzi in his Notizie della Scrittori Bolognesi, published in Bologna in 1794, and Lapenna touched upon Moretti in his overview of the Scholia, while Luca Carlo Rossi, and I might just mention this is the person who has most recently published the commentary by Calderini on the Ibis. She discusses very briefly Moretti as a possible source for Calderini's commentary in the introduction to her recently published edition. Now, my own research on the commentary tradition on Ovid has allowed me to uncover numerous other manuscript witnesses to the works of Moretti. In an earlier article published in Studi Medievali in 1998, I surveyed the manuscript evidence, and therefore today I shall provide but a brief and quick overview of the manuscripts, taking into account the one new witness discovered since the publication of that article. And I might say I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the manuscripts, but I'm just going to briefly survey them. Let's see. So let me just say to begin with, as I mentioned, there are really 4 works that he wrote. There's a short prose life of Ovid, which I usually refer to as Moretti I, and then there's a much longer prose life of Ovid, which I describe as Moretti II. There's also a versified life of Ovid, which is referred to in the manuscript as a Carmen de Ovidio. And I might just mention that this work is as yet unpublished, so hopefully it'll receive its editio princeps in this article. And then there's his commentary on the Ibis. And I might just mention that I published the 2 prose lives of Ovid in an article which appeared in Medieval Studies. That's on your bibliography. But the other works are as yet unpublished and don't seem to have received much attention. Now, the manuscripts of Moretti can really be divided up into 3 major areas. There are those which transmit the commentary on the Ibis and the longer prose life of Ovid, and the prose life usually introduces the commentary itself. There are several manuscripts which transmit only the prose lives of Ovid, and they're separate from the commentary on the Ibis, so there seems to be evidence for a separate transmission history of the lives. And there's a single manuscript which transmits the verse life of Ovid, which is referred to as the Carmen. So these are basically the 4 manuscripts which transmit the commentary on the Ibis itself. The one that I mentioned that I have not yet published and actually just found is number 4. It's in Rome in the Biblioteca Nazionale, and it's Varia 37. I might just mention that La Penna, in his introduction to the Scholia, mentions this as drawing on Bernardo's commentary. The problem is that it's lost its beginning, so it only begins at the commentary to verse 23 and runs to verse 197. But I've looked at it, transcribed large sections of it, and to me it seems to have the commentary. I'm not quite sure why La Penna says it's drawing upon it. The other ones, there are several manuscripts which contain manuscripts containing 2 prose lives of Ovid. One you might note is actually in Champaign-Urbana, which is itself a very interesting manuscript. And thirdly, the last one is in the Vatican. It's Reglat 1826, which has the Carmen de Ovidio. Now, the 3 manuscripts which transmit the complete text of the commentary are to be found, as one might expect, in Humanist Miscellanies. Paris Lat 8257 has a commentary on the Carmina Priapea by Bernardinus Celanius, while Florence 1202 also contains a commentary on Columella by Pomponio Leto. Reglat 1801 also contains Scholia to the Aratea of Germanicus. The verse life of Ovid is known from a single manuscript, Reglat 1826, which also transmits a number of other poems from the Anthologia Latina and Humanist verses on Ovid. Specifically, it has an oratio in Ovidium by Laurentius Rubius and verses on Ovid by Franciscus de Magistri. So it seems to form part of a kind of humanist miscellany which has these sort of verses and verse lives of Ovid. Now, none of the works of Moretti was published during the late 15th and 16th centuries. We do, however, seem to have some indirect evidence from the early 19th century that Moretti's glosses may still have been read by scholars from 1500 to 1800. For in Rudolf Merkel's edition of the Tristia and Ibis, published in Berlin in 1837, we find scholia printed, which seem to be drawn without acknowledgement from Moretti's glosses to the poem. Now, Moretti's major work of Ovidian biography, which I here label Moretti II, reflects the new critical approach applied to Ovidian biography in the later Renaissance. Fausto Ghisalberti, in a seminal article on the tradition of Ovidian biography published in the pages of the Journal of the Warburg and Cortot Institutes in 1946, underlined the movement of humanistic scholars away from the traditional classifications of the medieval ascesis to focus more exclusively on the life of Ovid. Humanists founded their life on an intimate knowledge of the primary and secondary sources. Now, Moretti too begins his life of Ovid by discussing the traditional events in Ovid's life: his birth at Salmona, his equestrian background, his early legal training, and love of poetry, leading to the abandonment of a legal career, his exile, and burial at Tomi. Moretti properly interprets the 2 verses from Tristia 4, 14, 5-6, as a reference to the Battle of Mutina in 43 BC, where the consuls Hirtius and Pansa lost their lives. And he alludes to Ovid's year in Athens and his facility in Greek. Moretti does repeat the causes for the exile, which had circulated in the Middle Ages, but with a degree of skepticism. He concludes that the ars amatoria was in all likelihood the real cause of banishment, while frankly confessing that some of the other reasons advanced, such as Ovid's affair with Livia, or his unwitting view of Augustus engaged in pederasty, and these are all things which circulated in the medieval Acessus, are pure guesswork. Moretti in general draws a highly sympathetic portrayal of the poet, emphasizing Ovid's prodigious talents and congenial mores. Moretti II establishes a complete and accurate list of Ovidian works. Only those works which can without doubt be considered part of the canon are admitted. Heroides, Amores, Ars Amatoria, Remedia Moris, Fasti, Medea, Metamorphoses, Tristia, Epistulae ex Ponto. Minor works now lost, which can be deduced from references in the poetry of exile, are also listed, and these include a wedding song for Ovid's friend Maximus, and a triumphal ode for Tiberius Caesar. The versified life of Ovid, written by Moretti, referred to in the manuscript by the title Carmen de Ovidio, will receive its editio princeps in this article. It is a 35-verse poem written in elegiac couplets, and falls within a recognized genre of humanistic writing, verse lives of the Latin poets. Other humanists who wrote verse lives of Ovid include Martino Filetico and Giovanni Battista Cantalicchio. The poems of Ovid are not named by title. Rather, Bernardo skillfully uses a paraphrase to designate them, and he alludes specifically to poems which may have been written during Ovid's youth, such as the De Cuculo and the De Pulica, and he lists the fragmentary Medicamina Faciae Feminae. Now let us now turn to Moretti's major Ovidian work, his commentary on the Ibis, and begin by drawing a few general conclusions about its approach to elucidating the poem and its intended audience. One may say at the outset that Moretti has an extensive and commanding overview of the major Latin authors, less so Greek authors, as well as the historians necessary to help explain the arcane allusions in the poem. Latin authors referenced by Moretti are far-ranging and include Virgil, Ovid, Horace, Propertius, Tibullus, Lucan, Martial, Statius, Juvenal, Varro, Cicero, Livy, Valerius Maximus, Pliny the Elder, Silius Italicus, Aulus Gellius, Sallust, as well as roughly contemporary authors such as Boccaccio, Musato, Leonardo Bruni, and Matthias Vegius. The list of Greek authors is, as one might expect, more restricted, but he does seem to know Hesiod, Herodotus, Plutarch, Homer, Archilochus, and Callimachus in Latin translation. Servius's commentary is extensively used, and he also draws upon the work of the 13th century Swiss mythographer Conradus de Mura for at least some of information on myth. The commentary in general seems to be aimed at the more elementary reader of the poem. We find, for example, many glosses specifically geared to grammatical points. And let me just say, let's see. Yeah. So here I've just sort of listed generally the 6 or 7 major areas that I see as his approaches to explicating the text. He's primarily interested in allusions to other writers, points of grammar, word usage and meaning, prose paraphrase, questions regarding the text of the Ibis, although I must say these are rather more limited, myth, background, and sources, questions of what I call a more literary nature, and finally I wanted to treat, in conclusion, his relationship to the commentary by Calderini published in 1474. So those are the major areas that I'm going to be focusing on. Now we find, for example, many glosses specifically geared to grammatical points. The accusative form of ibida is a Greek accusative. Deponents such as sequor and loquor, which have a Q in the present tense, changed to a C in the perfect participle passive and its derivatives. There is much paraphrasing of difficult or contorted word order in the poem, and sometimes rather complicated concepts are reduced to their simplest expression. And subtle differences in meaning between similar sounding words are explained. For example, how does ferigo differ from airigo? Since much of the poem is taken up with somewhat abstruse and recherché references to mythological figures and events, usually expressed indirectly through paraphrase, the commentary is devoted to providing background for the reader. There are places, it must be admitted, that Moretti concedes defeat and cannot identify an allusion, and the commentary is replete with such phrases as de hoc nihil habeo, or de hoc nihil aliud invenio. We also have clear evidence that the poem allows the commentator to branch off into ancillary topics and terms. What are the major rivers of Europe? What are the months of the year? And anyone who has read the commentaries of Marci on the Fasti and the rest know that this was fairly common in Renaissance pedagogy, that it gave the people an excuse to sort of branch off into other areas. There are also some places where the commentary does seem to work on a higher plane, attempting to show the reader how Ovid has cleverly structured the poem so motifs in a later section pick up those from an earlier section, or the commentator concentrates on Ovid's extended use of metaphor. Finally, there are a few sections of the commentary, but only a few, where Moretti ventures to give his opinion on a textual reading. In the time remaining, let us look at these categories more closely with examples taken from Moretti's commentary. So first, I look at allusions to other authors. I'm just going to get a... So one of the primary uses of references to classical Latin authors is to discuss other poems which may treat the same topic, individual or myth. For example, at line 35, Ovid alludes to the smoke that arose at the funeral pyre of Eteocles and Polynices, and the commentator both explicates the allusion and references Station and Lucan as writers who provide alternative versions. And I'm going to read my translation here. Let me say that sometimes I paraphrase a little bit of the Latin for time reasons. Sooner will the funeral pyre of Eteocles and Polynices be in agreement before there will be accord between you and me. Eteocles and Polynices were brothers born from Oedipus and Jocasta. Jocasta was the mother of Oedipus, and when he found out this crime, he blinded himself. These brothers fought each other for the kingdom. In life there was the greatest strife between them. And when their bodies were burned on the funeral pyre, the smoke divided into two streams, so that even in death their discord might be known. And then he goes on to reference Lucan in Book 1 and Statius in the last book of the Thebaid. You can see there Lucan and then Statius in Ultimo Thebaidus. And so Ovid says, the smoke was divided by the ancient wrath as the pyre burned. At line 173 and following, Ovid describes the punishments that await Ibis in the underworld. Ovid begins with an allusion to the Elysian fields, where Ibis will most definitely not reside. And the poet moves on to the punishments that await him, referencing Ixion, the Danaides, Tantalus, and Titios. So let me just... Yeah. So let me just run through that briefly. He means Tydeus, and Virgil speaks of him in the 6th book of the Aeneid, and Servius in his commentary on the passage, and nearly every author. Moretti goes on to reference Seneca, the Exponto, and Tibullus. And you can see there's a reference there to Seneca in the Hercules Furanes, and Ovid in the first book of the Ex Ponto. And the last few lines reference Tibullus. What historical sources does Moretti know in order to answer many of the questions that a reader might have concerning events in Roman history? Well, obviously, Livy is one of the primary sources, as well as Justinus. And here I've just given you one example of the way in which he uses historical sources. This is at line 389, where Hannibal is referenced, et quos dux Peneus. So he says, I have found nothing about this in Livy, though I read all about the Second Punic War. I have read in some old glosses that Hannibal put the Roman legates down a well and covered them with dust. And when the Romans asked after these legates, Hannibal said that they were not on his land. And then I have found nothing further. When Moretti references Greek authors, it is difficult to know if he has access to the original Greek or if he's getting the reference from a secondary source. And let me just see. Here we go. And I must say that I've transcribed all of the commentary, but I haven't yet gone through to isolate every reference to Homer. My impression is that he tends to use Homer in Greek sources much less than Irini does within his own commentary. And here he says, Thumanus was a Thracian bard, see Homer in the second book of the Iliad. There are also a few places where we find tantalizing allusions to a Latin translation of Callimachus, but to date I have not been able to track down any more details on this probable source, or on the probable source for this. And let me give you one example of that. I must say I wrote to the person who is the world's authority on the reception of Callimachus in the Renaissance, and he was not able to really be very forthcoming or helpful. So if any of you know anything about the Renaissance reception of Callimachus, I would be infinitely grateful for any information on this. He says, let's see, Darius, I'll just start with Darius, the second line there. Darius the second, I might say that Priami seems to be an error for Primi. Concerning Darius II, he is spoken of in the poems of Callimachus translated into Latin. May you perish like all those whom Darius II overwhelmed with ash. And as I say, there are several other references to this translation, but I haven't been able to find any sources for it. But finally, there is every indication that Moretti is abreast of contemporary treatments of myth. Boccaccio's Genealogia Daorum serves as a source material for our knowledge of mythology at several points. Albertino Musato is alluded to at least once in the commentary at line 135. Where Thrace is referenced, causing Moretti to go on a long digression about the various rivers called Timaeus. And he says here there is also another Paduan Timaeus river today called Brenta, which the Paduan poet Musato speaks of. And then he quotes the line from Musato. And we have a tantalizing reference to the poem on Meleager, published by the Neo-Latin poet Bassanio Bassini, only a few years before the composition of Moretti's own commentary. So this is a reference to Bassanio. He says, read about this story in the 8th book of the Metamorphoses, and throughout the work of Bassanio of Parma, who wrote an exceptional poem about this hunt. And finally, in the gloss to line 496, we find a reference to Matthias Vegius's commentary on Astyanax, written in 1430. Now, I want to move on to talk a little bit about points of grammar and comments of a pedagogical nature. There are many comments in Moretti's commentary that are of a purely grammatical nature and seem to indicate that the commentary was used by schoolboys who had to grapple with the basics of syntax and forms. For example, at line 5, Ovid uses the form requiem, and Moretti mentions that the form requietem is also found in Cicero. At line 228, the difference in meaning between the two forms, ferugo and airugo, is discussed. And he says, ferugo is the redness of iron, airugo that of bronze, as Juvenal says, your purse with all its redness. Others, however, say the color of ferugo is what we call baratinus, which indeed does not differ from the color of the redness of iron. And here's the gloss on loquor versus locutus. Loquor is a verb written with a Q, but in the supine and its derivatives, it is written with a C, and in the same way, the verb sequor. There are also innumerable places where unusual word usages are explained for the student. Ovid begins in the Ibis with a reference to a 5-year period, a lustrum. And Moretti not only explains its meaning in context in the Ibis, but also its various possible other meanings. And as I say, this is fairly reflective of the commentary as a whole. I'll just read through this quickly. So he says, that is to say 10, the reference from the first there, from the lemma. That is to say 10, that is 50 years. A lustrum is a space of 5 years, just as is the term Olympiad among the Greeks. It can also mean a brothel, whence Plautus in the Casina, your wife snatched you from the brothel. Sometimes a lustrum means a bed of wild animals, and it also means when the Roman people were counted in the census. We find this often in Livy. Lustrum also means a purification around the walls. Lucan in Book 1. Next, he ordered the citizens to march around the city to purify the walls with long lustration and to encircle the outer boundary of the long pomerium. Now, I have one or two other examples here, but I think in the interest of time, I may pass over them and move to another point. Let me just see. Yeah. So one other technique very favored by Moretti, and one that again seems to point to the pedagogical purposes of the commentary, is the prose paraphrase, whereby Ovid's verse is broken down into its component parts and explicated. For example, at line 123, Ovid writes, you have the verse there, sitque quod est rarum, and so what is rare, let the appearance of your fortune, bereft of favor, be a source of envy. And I'm translating it, I think, as Moretti himself understood it. If you look at some other translations, the grammar is taken slightly differently. But if we explicate what he says about it, we can see that he's taking it in that form. So he says, here is the sense. Face, that is the quality or state of your fortune, that is your misery. Be bereft, that is empty of usual favor. For the wretched and those who suffer have great sympathy with those who show pity. A source of envy, that is hated by all, which is rare. That is to say, may you bear so many evils, and may they be a source of hatred to all who see you, which is rare. That is to say, that scarcely happens. So you can see that much of the commentary is really taken up with this kind of prose paraphrase to help the student understand the actual nature of the grammatical construction. Moretti also shows an interest in questions of a textual nature, though such comments are somewhat rare. At line 210, Moretti is confronted with the two readings, lewis or lenus. Yeah, and so he says, read lewis and not lenus, for if you read lenus, the verse won't really stand. Of course, the bulk of the commentary is taken up with explicating abstruse and recherche references to myth, And one naturally asks what specific handbooks and sources lay behind Moretti's explanations. Often, he will send the reader to the appropriate fable in the Metamorphoses, or to the tragedies of Seneca, or to Servius, without further comment. And so here, when he gets to the references to Mira, Biblis, Meleager, you usually have a quote, see about this in book such and such of the Metamorphoses. Moretti also seems to know the Fabularius of Conradus de Mura. And I might mention that I think this mythographer is actually quite interesting. He composed his Fabularius about 1270 or so, and people seem to have supposed that it didn't have much circulation. But one of the things that I found working on my Vulgate commentary on the Metamorphoses, which was written about 1250 or 1260, is that there seemed to be a lot of connections between the Fabularius and the Vulgate, and there also seems to be a certain connection between Moretti and Conradus. So it seems like he had a much wider circulation or use than is usually credited him. So at line 539, Moretti knows two textual readings. Let me just give you this. So the line as Moretti has actually received it is conditor ut tardi blessus cognomine mirai. And I might just say that blessus is an error for lysus, which most of the modern editions read. So what he actually says here is, just as Blysus, who established the city of Mura in Arabia, was late in constructing walls and was captured by the enemy, and his limbs were dispersed through various places, I cannot find anything else about him. If we read cognitor, and so the problem here really is, are we to read conditor or are we to read cognitor, which is the other reading? So he says, if we read cognitor, we can understand Cinyras, the Cyprian king who slept with his daughter Mira, and later he found her out, but too late, for he had already had intercourse before he recognized her, and his cognomen was Blysus. It is better understood about Cinyras. But lest our audience be left with the sense that Moretti always operates on a more pedestrian level, let me conclude this overview of his commentary with some comments on what might be termed his literary interests. Namely, is he interested in the structure of the poem? Does he have a sense of imagery? What were Ovid's debts to his literary predecessors, particularly his Greek predecessors? Now, Moretti is quite scrupulous at delineating the large compositional structures of the poem. He notes the introduction to the invective proper, lines 1 through 66, in which Ovid introduces his enemy, refusing to name him, but labeling him with the title Ibis. At line 67, where the invective proper begins, Moretti comments. So he says, after the propositio, in the manner of Latin poets, Ovid invokes. And generally he calls upon all the gods of the sea, the land, and the sky. In addition, Moretti is good at showing how smaller units of the poem are given structural cohesion, as well as highlighting how certain cross-references may serve to connect the various strands of the invective. And I'll just give you one example of this. For example, lines 87 through 106 are primarily taken up with developing the sacrifice of Ibis on the altars of vengeance, and Ovid piles on references taken from sacrifice. So if you look at this section, he has Vota, Annuite, Precor, De Vovio, Nulla Mora Est, Hominibus Malis, and one can go on. Now, throughout this section, Moretti is quite good on illustrating how these motifs serve to interconnect the larger passage. And here I've just given you a few glosses which seem to illustrate this. You can see he's commenting on De Vovio at line 95. So he's, in all of these glosses, he's actually mentioning how the verb relates specifically to sacrifice and highlights it. And finally, let us make a few comments on how Moretti differs from the major commentary on the Ibis which circulated in the Renaissance, namely that of Domizio Calderini, published in Venice in 1474. Lapenna, in his introduction to the addition of the Scholia to the poem, notes that Moretti is essentially independent of Calderini, and I am in the main in agreement with this assessment. There is some overlap in interests. Both are interested in making sure that the reader understands what he is reading, and both provide extended explanation of myth. But in the main, Calderini is interested in explicating in detail the exact interconnections of the syntax of the Latin. Is less interested in explicating in detail the exact interconnections of the syntax of the Latin, and his comments often remain uniformly laconic. So his commentary is less given over to prose paraphrase and reworking of the Ovidian verse. Calderini also seems to show less interest in providing background information for the reader, certainly not to the degree Moretti does. Let me just give you one example of this. I know I'm almost ready to conclude because I see time is a little bit of the essence. You can see Calderini at verse 53 to 54 gives a very brief comment on the lemma tincta lacambeo. So tinged with Lacambian blood is the noun it goes with. So quibus talis vitam lacambes finivit is the only comment that Calderini makes, whereas Moretti goes on to say weapons tinged with blood of Lacambes. He uses a translatio, that is a shift of context. That is to say, if you persist further, I shall paint you with an iambic poem, and I shall compel you to hang yourself, just as the Spartan poet Archilochus forced Lacambes to do. Horace in the Ars Poetica, he was the founder of the genre. This Lacambes had promised his daughter refused. Archilochus, furious, attacked him with invented poetry and infamy, and Lacambes, wanting to avoid, hanged himself, and his daughter did the same. Now, let me also say that there are a few places, 3 or 4 places I've found, where Calderini seems to be alluding quite specifically to the commentary of Moretti. So he at least seems to have known it, although he doesn't use it extensively. And I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples of this, and then I'm going to conclude. This is a reference to 405, where we have a reference which seems to invoke specifically Moretti, and he says, "Male sunt interpretati, meo judicio qui hoc de Hippolito scriptum putant." So they've interpreted it badly. In my judgment, those who say that this verse relates to Hippolytus. And I must say that I went through all of the glosses on this line, and it seems that Moretti is the only commentator who makes this allusion. So this definitely does seem to indicate that Calderini is alluding quite specifically to Moretti. Let me just say I have 1 or 2 other examples, but I think I'll just move on to my conclusion. So though Ovid's great curse poem, the Ibis, written from his exile at Tomi, was known from the 12th to the 14th century, it was in the Renaissance period when one particularly saw a burgeoning interest in explicating this poem. Commentaries proliferate, both anonymously and from the pen of such renowned humanists as Christophorus Zerotis, Petrus Marsus, and Domitius Calderinus. Our research for a forthcoming volume of the Catalogus Translationum et Commentariorum, dealing with the medieval and humanistic school tradition on Ovid, has allowed us to identify some 40 anonymous and named commentaries on the Ibis dating from the 15th and 16th centuries. In addition, we have references to some 12 commentaries no longer extant. So that brings the total to about 52 commentaries during this period. No doubt the popularity of the work for those humanists resided in part in the extremely abstruse and recherché mythological references which allowed them to show off their own erudition. In today's talk, we have examined more closely one such humanist commentator on the Ibis. Bernardo Moretti may not be considered the most sophisticated or illuminating commentator on the invective. Certainly his skill seems to lag behind those of Irini. But he is of interest as a newly discovered humanist commentator, one who is working at Bologna, where there is a great deal of interest in the Ibis and Ovid generally. Until more commentaries on the poem have been edited and made available in print, it will be difficult to make definitive judgments about Moretti's place in the tradition. And here I might just say that of all the commentaries on the Ibis, only Irini's has actually appeared in a modern edition. Nevertheless, I hope today's paper has given the audience a window into the writings and interests of this hitherto unknown humanist. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. There's time for some questions. So, Ingo.
Well, thank you very much. I just sort of footnote question, really. When you were showing us the slide with the sort of parallel passages for the myth of Titios, he doesn't seem to refer to Ovid's Metamorphoses 4, where Titios is sort of the first in the Sedis Celerata, with languages quite sort of similar, although it's a slight past.
Yeah, you think of book 10?
No, book 4.
Book 4.
Juno goes down.
Right, okay.
And sort of gets Tisiphone up. And then you continued saying that the Metamorphoses is sort of reference to mythological material. So I was wondering about the systematicity with which he's...
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say... not sure I can say too much on that. I can certainly say that generally when he seems to reference the Metamorphoses when he's talking about a myth generally. And I think I would agree with you that he doesn't seem to allude to the Metamorphoses as much when he's talking about specific philological detail. So usually the comment is, if you want to know more about this myth, see book 8 of the Metamorphoses, or what's it, John?
Yeah, just on the Callimachus translation in the Renaissance. I don't know a great deal about this, but I have enjoyed actually Poliziano's translation of the 5th hymn.
Oh.
So I know that he was looking
Is it to my great shame that I don't know about this?
These hymns, but I don't know that he did any more than that.
Okay, I'll check.
I mean, that is a kind of virtuoso hymn anyway, because it's the one that's in elegiac couplets. And but so that's something you might have a look at. And I didn't recall where that came from, the bit you quoted.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that people have been, I think they see it as a fragment.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they can relate it to, and in fact, the person I spoke with in Italy just didn't seem to be very forthcoming. He wasn't able to tell me very much. And in the Scoli I've looked at, there may be 3 or 4 allusions to this in Bernardi's commentary, but as I say, I haven't been able to localize. And one of the things that I think I still need to do is try to find some of the sources, because some of them are fairly difficult to track down.
You say that the commentary is designed or is suitable for schoolboys. I just wondered, is the Ibis a common text in late medieval Renaissance school curriculum?
Yeah, yeah, it's used quite a bit. And I guess I would look at, I think Black is of course the one who has probably done most work on this.
Right.
Yeah, it did seem, pardon me?
We regard it probably as always very difficult.
Yes, I would, yeah.
Text.
Well, I think one of the reasons why it was popular was because of all of the mythological allusions. Yeah, it is very strange, because I must say when I took the Ovid seminar at Toronto, when I was there with Richard Tarrant, of course the Ibis was the one work that we didn't read.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting to think what it did to the schoolboys' brains.
But related to that, I was thinking it was interesting that someone had got to the point of reading the Ibis needed to be told about loquor locutus.
Yeah.
This seems a bit weird.
There seems to be a big range of types of comments that you work with.
Sorry?
There seems to be a big range.
Yes, yes, no, there are. Yeah, that's true.
Very elementary.
Yeah, yeah.
Others looking much
Yeah.
more sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I guess in some sense it's a little bit like this Vulgate commentary that I've been working on the Metamorphoses from the 13th century, because it runs the whole range as well, from the most elementary sort of comments to, and I don't know, as I say, I don't know whether it was an indication that you could teach the work at various levels, or...
Yeah. Yes, it could be. This would be useful for whatever you were doing.
I mean, his commentary is very different from Calderini, in that Calderini has much more literary interest, and he seems to be much more exclusively interested in source material and...
Yes.
For an Ovidian commentator, it was interesting that for a work as obscure as this, that he was interested in sex as well. That comment on cognitor.
Yes. Yeah.
Taking that in a sort of a sense of biblical knowledge, and
well, one of the things...
that rather than conditor, which seems on the face of it to be more correct.
Yes, yes.
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Well,
but he sees the opportunity to comment on sex, which is interesting.
well, one of the things I must say I was a bit disappointed in was the fact that every time Ovid has a sexual allusion in the poem, or something that could be interpreted as a sexual allusion, like an aphrodisiac, or he seems to be pretty mute about. But say so. But as I say, I'm hoping. At one point, I was hoping of actually editing the work, but I've transcribed it all from the manuscripts. But I'm not, as I said, I'm not sure it's going to happen at this point. So, if anybody's interested in it, let me know.
Any more questions or comments?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Frank, again for a very interesting